Hi, this is Patrick Schultz, Extension Forester with Washington State University in Southwest Washington. You're listening to a webinar on wildfires in Western Washington. This took place in June of 2020. You're about to hear from two speakers from the Department of Natural Resources. The first is Daniel Donato. He's a researcher with the department and also has an appointment with the University of Washington. He's going to be sharing some of his research and discussing fire ecology in the western part of the state, what that means for homeowners and forest owners in this region. And then you'll be hearing from Ashley Blazina, who's a wildfire preparedness coordinator with the DNR. She's going to share some tips on how to prepare and plan for wildfires in the future. You're also on the line, and you'll be hearing from occasionally is Matt Preventure, stewardship forester with the DNR, and Sean Alexander, who is an extension forester with Washington State University in the eastern part of the state. So I really hope you enjoy this webinar. If you have any questions about this topic, feel free to reach out to any of the speakers, the people involved. I put their contact information up here. You can also reach out to me at patrick.schultz@wcu.edu, and I'm happy to help however I can or point you in the right direction. If you have a few minutes after the end of the webinar, I would really appreciate you taking a brief 3 to 5 minute anonymous survey to share your thoughts on this program. If you're watching on the YouTube site, this link is right below the video. It should be very obvious to click on, and should only take a couple minutes. But your thoughts, your input on these programs are what make them better. So I really appreciate you taking a couple minutes to do that. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the webinar and feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks.
It worked.
Looks good.
Okay, does that look good?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, I gotta try and get the Zoom thing out of my way on my screen.
Okay.
All right, so yeah, we kind of already did the introduction in terms of who I am. Yeah, in the title there, I have the fires in Western Washington are a different animal, so that's something I really want to emphasize about the distinction from the east side, as we were just talking about. Just a little bit more about what my background and what I do. I like to study disturbances, or what I call mayhem in the forest of all kinds. So windstorms, insect outbreaks, fires and volcanoes, how they kind of knock forests over, and then how forests kind of recover and move forward old growth conditions through different paths. And I've been doing that kind of research for, gosh, I don't know, 20, 25 years. The last 7 or so with the DNR. So jumping into the topic, so this is a map of fire perimeters from a recent 30-year period, and there's a distinct pattern there that I think all of you can notice and probably already intuitively know, that there appears to be kind of a firewall with a cascade crest, that basically just about every fire acre we've had over the last 3 decades has been on the east side. And so we've kind of been lulled into this sense of fires an east side issue and not so much a west side issue. Of course, that's changing now, as Patrick was saying.
Hey, Dan, this is Matt. Can I
this is a map of fire regimes in Region 6, the fourth.
Dan, can you hear us real quick? Dan,
what was that?
Yeah, I think we're having a couple issues with your audio there.
Oh, okay.
It's just coming off a little garbled is actually a good word. As someone described it. That's somebody described it. Is there any way you can get closer to the speaker maybe, or?
Sure. How is this?
That's great. I think that's better. What does everybody think?
Does this seem to be an improvement when I talk like this?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that, Dan.
I think it was just speaker. I think it was a simple issue of speaker placement.
Okay, cool. Good.
Cool. Easily resolved. Phew.
Yeah, right? All right, go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to show this figure of fire regimes a lot. A lot of you might know this kind of thing, but for those that don't, or even those that need a refresher, this is a map of sort of broad brush fire regimes in the Northwest, in the Cascades and moving west. From the red, where we have frequent but low severity fires, and then moving up through frequency and severity classes until you get to the black zone, which is most of the west side. That's what we call infrequent but high severity. So there's fire is rare, but when it occurs, it's high severity or stand replacing. It kills most of the trees. So it's colored black, I think, is appropriate because it's the fire regime that arguably we know the least about, just because events are so rare that there's just not a lot of record to go on and not a lot of evidence. So we have to kind of piece things together. So I'll be talking about some interesting things we pieced together for the West Side. So a lot of the interest in West Side Fire really kind of took off a few years ago, in part because of all the big fires that burned through towns and other things in California, big wind-driven fires. And then also that smoky summer we had in 2017 really seemed to put fire on the radar for West Siders, more so than it had been. So when those things happened, we started to get questions, we being researchers on fire, what can we expect for West Side fires here in terms of frequency, just how big are they, what kind of impacts do they have? And so we've been kind of looking into that. And I guess here I'll digress for a minute to say some of what I'm going to talk about will have a bit of a doomsday flavor. That's in part because of just the nature of the topic. But also I think it's okay to sort of delve into that if it helps get people's attention, to sort of approach West Side Fire in a more informed way. So we'll go there. But bear with me and I'll circle around to some things we can do to mitigate and prepare. So it'll be that kind of ride. So back to the fire regime map. There's a lot, like I said, that we don't know, but there are some things we do know about fire on the West Side. One of which is the occurrence of really big fires in modern history. So the 1902 Yakult burn burned most of the Southwest Washington Cascades and the Columbia Gorge area. That was 1902. I'll throw some numbers on that one later on in the talk. And of course, the famous Tillamook burn of 1933, which was also several 100,000 acres. So we at least have a couple data points that large events, stain replacing fires, can happen on the West Side. One of the parallels we've been making is to our earthquake regime. If you guys remember, just 10, 15 short years ago, California was the earthquake state and we were not the earthquake states. Now we know that's not the case. And instead what we have is longer periods between earthquakes than California. So we got lulled into thinking we don't have earthquakes, but when we do get them, they're actually more intense than most California quakes. So it's just something to keep in mind. The analogy seems appropriate. A little bit of background about the research we were doing that kind of led us down this path. So we were tasked with a question. So we manage public forest land. We answer to a lot of stakeholders all across the spectrum. And the question, one of the things we manage for, in addition to timber and everything else, is late successional habitat, older forest. And so we've got everyone on the spectrum from wishing that we would, or thinking that we should manage for very little old forest, to managing for the whole landscape as old forest. The thinking being on that end that the whole landscape was old forest before European settlement. But we also know that fires were operating on the historic landscape, so it couldn't have been old growth all the time. So the question then is, if it's not 100%, what percent could it be? And if you want to know about old growth in the West Cascades, you got to know something. You got to figure out what's going on with the fire regime. And so we recently published a paper on this. So what I'm going to show you has gone through peer review and all that good stuff. It starts with a real basic life cycle model of West Side forest. So it starts in a stand replacing fire, regenerates and grows through stem exclusion and maturation toward old growth in the circle there. And on the order of a few centuries, it burns again and starts over. So when we look at verdant West Cascades landscapes, like this is one of my favorites in the Southern Washington Cascades, around Mount St. Helens, these landscapes appear green and verdant, and they are, but they are born in fire. And so if we zoom in on that upper photo, and then I throw some arrows on here, if you look closely, I hope it resolves on all of your screens, you can see patches of taller, rougher canopied forests in a matrix of kind of younger, smoother canopied forests. You can see the boundaries. And those are old burn scars. In fact, I believe that is the 1902 Yakult burn scar, the younger forest. So at one point, this landscape, much of it looked like that. And it's always an interesting reminder to remember that. And so the Eagle Creek fire, like, and other recent events like the North Peak fire, Paradise fire on the west side, they seem dramatic to us, and they have dramatic effects for us in some ways, but for this system, it's very much business as usual. So if we go back to our life cycle of the forest model, I'm a field guy, but I work with people who know about models. Luckily, my colleague Josh Olofsky is pretty handy with those. So we basically made this into a sophisticated in its execution, but the concept is very simple model. Basically, forests grow and sometimes they burn, just like the life cycle shows. And we do this across the whole West Cascades landscape. But what we had to do was figure out how to make that fire regime kind of operate on the landscape over time, which means you have to figure out how often fire visits the landscape and how big they are when they do. So that's when we learned something about West Side fires, and this is where I'll get into the meat of the things we learned that I think will be of interest to you guys. So I'm going to start you off with a little math exercise, which I know is dangerous, but this tends to work. If I tell you the West Cascades area is about 6 million acres, solid number. One of the things we do know about fire on the west side is the fire rotation for much of the Cascades averages around 500 years, I'm rounding. And fire rotation means that's the time it takes for that whole landscape to burn. So over the course of 500 years, on average, that whole landscape will see fire at some point, once. So if I say during that 500-year cycle, there's only one fire, how big does that fire have to be? Normally, when I'm talking to a group, they can answer me, but you guys can't answer me now. Of course, that would have to be one giant 6 million acre mega fire, once every 500 years on average. Pretty simple math there. If I take one more step and say if there's 2 fires every 500 years, so now we're at 250-year intervals, it would have to be 2 very large fires still that are 3 million acres. Simple algebra. Jump ahead to a fire every 100 years. So now on average, there's 5 fires during every 500-year cycle. Each of those fires would have to average 1.2 million acres. Hopefully you're all still with me. And we know fires in the West Cascades are fairly rare, so we're already kind of getting in a reasonable ballpark here, and we're still dealing with some pretty big numbers, right? So I'm going to jump way ahead now and say, what if there's 20 fires during that time? So this would be a fire somewhere in the West Cascades every 25 years, which is more than we think tends to happen, at least in terms of major fires. And that would still have to be a 300,000 acre fire on average. So I walk you through this exercise I'm going to show you some more sophisticated versions that we did to solve this equation, but to show you that there's not really any voodoo involved. It's pretty simple math based on some pretty good numbers. So again, this would be the average fire size under that simple algebra model. And this is a graph of fire size on the x-axis and the likelihood of that fire on the y-axis. And you guys are probably all familiar with a normal curve or a bell curve. That would be the average fire size, but there's tails, right? So some would be smaller and some will be even larger. And that's a nice model, but that's actually not the way the universe works. The way natural events are actually structured is along a power law. So the axis is the same, the axes are the same in this graph. But what that shows you is that the small fires at the left side of the graph are the most likely, most common events. And then that tail going off to the right is the rare but really, really big events. So I show you that just to show you that kind of we solve this equation in a more sophisticated way. But if that's too much math for a dinner talk, then what I'm talking about is a concept that you guys are probably all familiar with from media reports. When we talk about floods, I'll bet you all have heard of a 25-year flood, a 50-year flood, a 100-year flood. And you probably intuitively know that the 50-year flood is bigger than the 25-year flood, and the 100-year flood is even bigger. So the bigger the event, the rarer it is. So this is a map showing like a 100-year flood in a Puget Sound region, and then a 500-year flood, which floods much more area. So all we did was apply this same concept, which incidentally applies to pandemics, just to bring it to some current events. Every year we have a run-of-the-mill flu, right? Every decade or so, every 10 years, we might have one that's especially virulent or has higher mortality. And then every 100 years, apparently, we have something like the Spanish flu or the coronavirus that's a super big pandemic. Similar distribution, that's the way natural events are structured, and we're experiencing it now. So basically we solved that math size, or that fire size algebra with that kind of distribution of things. And this is kind of a table we came up with to say, okay, there's different types of events for fires. There's the 25-year fire, the 50-year fire, and so on. And we solved the equation and came up with our best estimates of fire sizes. And you can see that they range quite a bit, and that the maximum fire size that we think there is such thing, judging by the literature from tree rings and charcoal records, that there is such thing as a 200-year fire event. And that is well over 1 million acres. And the century scale return fire is still 500,000 acres. So those are big events, and they line up a bit with some of those earlier events I was telling you about. In terms of contemporary fires that we've been seeing, things like the Eagle Creek fire or the Norse Peak fire that burned on the west side in recent years, those would be the baby fires, the common ones that are kind of a drop in the bucket overall compared to the main events, really. But keep these in mind. I'll revisit this table a few times. So we do know a lot about, we knew enough to come up with central estimates, but there is a lot we don't know still, because there's, like I said, scant information on West Side fire regimes. So we did what any prudent person would do when there's a lack of information. We basically played a what if game. We call it a sensitivity analysis. It said, what if the literature parameters we're drawing on are wrong in one direction, or what if they're wrong in the other direction? And then we reran the calculations. And then we did that for a couple different variables, fire frequency, and fire rotation. And you don't need to know everything about what those are. If you do, great. But suffice to say, we solved for that maximum fire size for all combinations of variables. And I want to emphasize that we really tried to break the model here. We took the literature and went as far as we could plausibly take an estimate to the left, and then as far as we could plausibly take it to the right, and we did that for both variables. So by the time we fill in this table with 9 estimates of the maximum fire size, the right value is somewhere between the numbers in this table. So that 1.7 million acres is our best central estimate. And then these are all the other estimates we came up with. So there'll be a quiz on all these numbers at the end. But seriously though, the thing to take away from this is that there's a heck of a lot of zeros, regardless of how we solve the equation or what parameters we take from the literature. Basically, there's no way to solve the equations for fire sizes based on the information we have without there being really epic fires on the west side. So when you get numbers like that, of course, you question, okay, is that consistent with evidence? And it actually is. From tree ring records, there appears to have been about 1 million acre fire or more around the year 1700 on the Olympic Peninsula, and several million acres around that same time in western Washington. The Yakult complex in 1902 is estimated to have exceeded 1 million acres, and the Tillamook burn, it was about 350,000 acres. So we're in the ballpark. Another set of evidence, I guess, was from early land surveys. So these were the land surveyors that went out at the turn of the 1900s, during the settlement era, and they mapped forest resources, and they also mapped burn patches. It was a snapshot of just what happened to be present at that time in the late 1890s. And you can see those cross-hatched areas are burn patches that were there at that time. They're probably not perfect. They're probably rough sketches. But nevertheless, the largest patch size they estimated to be over 1 million acres. and they found 5 patches that were over 250,000 acres. So another line of evidence that's at least consistent with this idea of really large burn patches on the west side. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit from talking about how big fires can be to how they happen. The modus operandi of large west side fires appears to involve the alignment of 3 factors. The first 2 are pretty consistent with just about any forested region. The first one being exceptional summer drought, or at least a very deep summer drought. So it's usually a late summer phenomenon. Late August or September is actually when most of the big fires have occurred on the west side. 2015 was a great example. That would have been primed if the other factors had lined up. I don't know if you guys remember that one, the year of no snow and no spring rain. Of course, you have to have an ignition source, which is less common on the west side than the east side, but of course it takes that. And then the third one is the real sort of wild card, and that is wind, but a very certain type of wind. Call it a synoptic east wind event. It's set up by a high pressure in the interior and low pressure offshore, and you get a really strong westerly flow, or I guess that easterly flow, from the east to the west. And what happens is it takes a small fire that's creeping around and blows it up like crazy, and it burns huge acreages in a matter of hours or a day or 2. So as an example, the Tillamook burn experienced a synoptic east wind event, and it burned 200,000 acres of its 350,000 in a single 24-hour period. For those of you counting at home, that's burning at a rate of 2.5 acres per second. The Yakult burn advanced 30 miles in a day and a half. So it basically traversed the entire West Cascades in 36 hours under the synoptic east wind. So some parallels again with California. Their big fire events and the destructive fire events are very much driven by a very similar atmospheric phenomenon. Downslope winds from east to west. They call them various names: Santa Ana winds, Diablo winds. There's another one too, I can't recall. But similar phenomenon. The difference is they get their wind events basically annually or multiple times annually, and ours appear to be less frequent. And they appear to coincide with a west side ignition even less frequently. But otherwise, very much analogous. And so one thing I like to think of it like, it's helpful to me, is that it's not so much that the big west side fires are a fire event. They're really more of a wind event that happens to have fire in it. And I'll revisit this when we come to sort of how we prepare and mitigate for these fires, because that is a really important factor. It's kind of a climatic phenomenon as much as anything else. So when we think about west side, verdant, lush, green, rainforest type environments, it's always good to remember that this is how they start. And going back to our earthquake analogy, the fire regime appears to be fairly similar to our rare but severe in impact earthquake regime of our Cascadia subduction quakes. And so we've started calling these the biggest west side fires Cascadia subduction fires, because they have that same regime, and also the amount we can prepare and mitigate them might be somewhat similar. They're kind of just a natural force. A few things to keep in mind. This isn't just a historical behavior for this landscape. It's something that's coded in the DNA of the West Cascades landscape. So it's something that's as relevant today, actually, as it's ever been. Climate change, of course, is affecting patterns of summer drought and temperatures. We're seeing that already. Its effects on the west side aren't super clear, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But you've noticed that I haven't made this a climate change talk. This isn't really about how west side forests are changing. It's more about how they are programmed to behave from the start. Another really critical aspect I like to emphasize is that unlike the east side, large fires or severe fires on the west side are not a product of forest mismanagement. we're all familiar with the narrative on the east side and interior forests of fire suppression and high grade logging and other things that have really changed the structure of those forests and contributed to fuel buildup and so on, and other forest health problems. But on the west side, these are the most productive forests on the planet, and they are always abundant in biomass, which is another word for fuel. And so they always have sufficient fuel to carry fire. It's just kind of, again, how they're programmed. So when the big fires occur on the west side, or when the Eagle Creek fire occurred, I was always kind of pushing against that narrative of a forest mismanagement problem. And in terms of the system itself, I mean, big fires on the west side would have a big socioeconomic impact and aesthetic impact and everything else. But in terms of the ecology of that system, it's really business as usual. And resilience to those events is in their DNA, like I said. It's another thing to keep in mind. So when we first started giving these talks, we got a lot of questions on these lines, and I'm certainly happy to entertain more of questions along these lines, but I figure they come up often enough that I'll talk about them a bit. This idea like, well, these are historical events that you guys are estimating, but they couldn't happen today, right? It's such a different landscape now. Maybe, but some of the main factors that we think might contribute to the landscape being different today are these three: fire suppression, modern infrastructure, and fuels management. I'll go through each one. Fire suppression, of course, we have tankers and dozers and retardant drops and hotshot crews and 20-person crews. And incidentally, in that lower photo at the lower left corner is yours truly on a Type 2 hand crew many years ago. I'm still involved in wildland firefighting. So I speak with a little bit of experience on this, not a authority by any stretch, but remember the third factor in what drives the really big west side fires, when we get the synoptic east wind event and we get these blow up events where it's covering, many acres, per minute. These are the types of events that as firefighters, we step aside and watch in awe as Mother Nature does her thing, because no amount of heavy equipment or firefighting really has an effect when a fire is behaving like that. Not to say fire suppression cannot have a role. I'm going to revisit that in a bit, but it's important to remember that it has limitations, and those limitations can be hit pretty commonly on the west side. So during a wind event, fire suppression infrastructure is kind of a non-factor. How about modern infrastructure? So we have forest roads and access going everywhere. We can make fire lines and other fuel breaks. We have 8 and 10 lane freeways. In California, during those fires they had recently, those fires jumped the 8-lane freeways because the winds are blowing the embers basically horizontally. And that is basically a perfect fuel break. You could not design a better fuel break. So there's that. And then even in other events like the Yellowstone fires in the lower right there, that's the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, which is an enormous geographic feature. And those fires jumped that canyon. And then in our neck of the woods, even something like the Eagle Creek fire, which again was one of the kind of baby events by West Side standards, jumped the Columbia River, which is also a pretty darn good fuel break. So the types of events we deal with on the west side, modern infrastructure can still not really pose enough of a barrier, I guess, to prevent their spread. How about fuels management? Well, again, we're in the most productive forest region on the planet, and this is just a schematic showing all the different stages of forest development, following disturbance or plantation establishment through maturation to old growth. None of these stages are fuel limited on the west side. So it's a term we use in fire ecology and fire science about whether a certain forest type or a region is fuel limited in its fire regime or climate limited. And the west side is not fuel limited, it's climate limited. So there's always abundant fuels. It's just we don't have the right climatic conditions or ignition source or wind event or whatever it is to get a fire on the west side usually. And the thing with trying to manage fuels on the west side is that you would, if to get fuels down to a level that would not carry these types of events, would fundamentally alter the system into something unrecognizable. that probably wouldn't deliver the sort of goods and services and aesthetics that we associate with these forests. In other words, you basically have to pave it. So there's exceptions to that, and I'll get into those, but it's important to really keep in mind the limitations of fuel management on the west side. And the other thing I'll add to that is that we can't even keep up with rotating needs for fuel treatments on the east side, where things grow back slowly after we treat them. Imagine on the west side, where we're trying to keep up with the most productive forest growth on the planet, where we'd have to retreat stands, you know, every few years. It would be an impossible task, at least on a large scale. Okay, so I mentioned climate change earlier. I will talk about it a little bit here. There's things we know and don't know about what's going to happen in the future. Here's our three drivers of what the biggest west side fires. Number one, the drought. We're already seeing that increasing, so that looks like we're probably going to have, at least, if you consider it like rolling 3 dice and they all have to come up snake eyes, we're loading one of the dice there with changing the climate, because the summer drought period is getting longer and deeper. So there is that. And then ignitions. If we look at this graph, this is an interesting plot. This is the percent of fire starts that are either caused by lightning in orange or humans in blue on the west side. And so you can see about 90-some% of the fires in most years are caused by humans, not lightning. And of course, we all know that we're getting quite the population increase in the Northwest. And with more population comes more people out using the forest, and arguably probably more opportunities for human-caused ignitions. So that dice is getting loaded a little bit. The third one, though, is the question mark. So far, we don't have a great handle on the synoptic east wind events, because they're driven by kind of macro to mesoscale atmospheric circulation events. The right sort of ducks got to get in a row for this kind of event to happen, and they're already pretty infrequent. Some colleagues and I have a research grant to actually look into this to see if these events are likely to increase or decrease in the future. And there's some evidence that could go either way. We could get less of them, we could get more. So without any change in those, it's really hard to say whether the big fires are going to change much in the future. So I've been talking mostly about the black zone on the west side, which covers most of western Washington, and that's where our research has been focused. So I'm a little biased there, just because I've been sort of steeped in that recently. But I do want to talk a little bit about the other parts of western Washington where maybe a lot of you live or own forest land, in the lowlands, the tan and purple areas, which are the different kinds of mixed severity fire regimes. So these are fires a little bit more frequent and can be a little more mixed in its severity, instead of all stand replacement or primarily stand replacement. So just kind of a picture tour of some of those. Puget Lowlands, let's see, the Puget Trough around Fort Lewis, the rain shadow of the Olympic Peninsula, San Juan Islands. I'm trying to think of some others, but yeah, you get the idea. These are generally drier areas, and so we can get fires more frequently there. We find fire-scarred trees more often there. And this is a schematic you see in a lot of fire ecology textbooks about the kind of patch size distribution we see in the different fire regimes. So I've been talking about the high, where it's dominated by that red high severity stand replacing patch color. When you get down to the mixed and moderate fire regimes, you get kind of a more salt and pepper look, where the patches of stand replacement in red are smaller, and you get a lot of intervening blue areas there that are surviving forests that were surface fire. So in these areas, it's a little bit more maybe what we're used to thinking on the east side, not quite exactly, but some of the things that we're familiar with from the east side are at least a bit more relevant. Because these are less sort of major climatic event-driven fires, where weather's just running over everything. The nuances of fuels and their structure and their pattern and their abundance become more important, and topographic features can be more important, like ridge lines and creeks. There still are occasional patches of high severity when, you know, a big weather event can still come through these areas. But the small to moderate fire events are more common, and some of those might sort of be in that more manageable box compared to the big wind-driven events I described earlier. And so here, some of our Eastside principles being more applicable. Let's talk about that more right here. So I'm going to leave most of kind of how do we manage in light of knowing these things about West Side fires. I'm going to leave most of that to Ashley, who's going to have a lot more detail, but I want to touch on a couple concepts briefly. I've kind of talked about two different flavors of West Side fire. We have the small to moderate events and the large extreme events. So the small to moderate events are going to be most relevant in that kind of purple to tan zone, and also some of the fires like the 25-year events in the black zone. So I showed this table earlier. There are really big fires at century return interval scales, but there's also, we think, and current evidence seems to point to, smaller, moderate weather events that also happen. So we can kind of break down our preparation or mitigation with those two flavors in mind. So for the small to moderate events and down in those lower areas, we can think more about like classic firewise principles, like fuel treatments, especially around infrastructure. Things like fuel breaks on the landscape might make a difference in those areas or for those smaller events. And things like diversifying the landscape with different forest structures, age classes, and composition, especially maybe hardwood component in some areas, might actually make a difference for the way these moderate scale events behave. For the large extreme events, those are more like an earthquake or a hurricane. They're kind of a natural just force. And what we've been kind of encouraging is to emphasize prompt detection and aggressive suppression early. Because like I said, most of those big fires start out as small fires that are creeping around, maybe during a dry summer when our firefighting resources are distracted elsewhere on the east side. And then an east wind event kicks up and we've lost it. And so there's reason to invest in that kind of prompt detection and aggressive early suppression on the west side, because if you catch one of those before the east wind event happens, then you might have just bought yourself another 50 or even 100 years until the next one happens. And you don't know which one it's going to be. Moreover, there's not much drawback to fire suppression on the west side, especially in the Mesic to wetter forests, because they're already fuel choked, to use a fire management word. Basically missing another decade or three of fire is not going to build fuels to an unnatural level like it does on the east side, because there's already tons of fuels on the west side. And then the other thing is to prepare our infrastructure and prepare for the eventuality that at some point one of those large events is going to happen. And one example I think is really illustrative was this article in the LA Times, which if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you all to read. I think it's an important read. The analogies are pretty clear to our area. So you see in the lower left there's the town of Paradise, California, which we all know from the news stories now. And those black and white dashed lines are fuel breaks that they had put in over the years preceding that fire event. And what happened was, the quote is, "A blizzard of embers flew over the fuel breaks as if they didn't exist." And the fire spread map is staggering, the way that happened. It really was like they didn't exist. And then secondly, that town had actually done a pretty good job following defensible space rules in terms of clearing vegetation and firewood and other things away from their homes, and following those general guidelines. But what happened was, during a wind-driven event like that, when the fire approached the neighborhood, the primary fuel carrying the fire stopped being the vegetation and started being the houses themselves. And the lesson there was, defensible space is good, but we also need to harden the infrastructure in terms of the way houses are put together and clad to make them less likely to be the fuel that carries the fire for these types of events. So to wrap up, West Side takeaways. I hope I've convinced you that West Side fires can be really scary large, region-shaping events. Not all of them are that, but they can get to that size. It's all about the high productivity, meaning that fuels are always super abundant on the West Side. It's just how this system works. And really, it's about the climate. These events are driven by extreme weather phenomena. The climate change effects are uncertain, but we can probably bank that there's not going to be less fire in the future, given the way the trends are moving. And we really need to think beyond kind of the fuel management paradigm that we emphasize on the east side, because on the west side, in many cases, it would be ineffective or even counterproductive. And instead, we need to think about different flavors of West Side fire, like the moderate condition events where we can do things to mitigate for those, like the fuel breaks and the fuel treatments around the WUI, the wildland-urban interface around infrastructure. And then the extreme condition events where we need to think more like earthquakes and hurricanes and prepare, harden our infrastructure, maybe think about evacuation routes for towns like Issaquah or Toutle or Amboy, things like that. I had read an article where some fire ecologist says those towns keep them awake at night because of this issue. So, yeah, so hopefully I've opened your eyes a bit to that idea. And that's all I have for now. So I guess we can transition to whatever you think's next, Patrick, a Q&A, and move over to Ashley eventually.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. That was awesome. I think we've got quite a few questions actually. I've been kind of putting them into a Word doc just to consolidate them a little bit. And I will try to get as many as we can. You know, consider continuing to put questions in the chat box, but we'll probably have to stop about 7-ish, and we'll take like a quick 5-minute break, and we'll get to Ashley's presentation. So the first question we had was from Glenn Rogers. He had a question about that slide. I believe it was showing the different fire regimes across Western Washington. You showed it a couple times. And he asked over what period that was that information was collected, I guess, or over what period that is intended to show.
I guess it's meant to capture kind of the historical regimes, probably going back, say, a couple thousand years, most, and reflecting, you know, certainly up to the settlement period. Things have been altered a bit now with the way we manage fire starts, but
sure.
Yeah, hopefully that answers you.
Yeah, I think so. Well, Jesse had more of a comment, and I don't know, Ashley, if you were planning on answering this because you commented too, but she said, I hope you can speak to the native populations and their control burns. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Couple things. There's a lot we don't know about that either. What do I want to say? We think that most of those prescribed fires basically were around settlements and travel corridors. It may not have affected kind of the higher and mid elevation parts of the mountains. There's no way that we can be sure about that. But wherever they had an effect, all of the data that went into the studies in the literature that we pulled fire regime numbers from account for Native American burning too. So I want to point that out. Because those are just records of tree rings and fire origin or forest origin dates and charcoal records from fires that were started by anything. And so that incorporates both lightning and whatever ignitions Native Americans were doing through time. Okay,
interesting. So this one you may have, you kind of touched on, but it might be a good chance to reiterate is, can we fight these types of fires or do we let them burn? And I guess so it's sort of that contrast between small to moderate events and large events, and how do we determine between the two?
Yeah, that's another good one. So when they start, those two events look exactly the same because they both start as small to moderate events, and it's only when you get that big wind event that's going to kick it into the mega fire. So without being able to know, we encourage that for most of the west side, there's really no harm ecologically in just suppressing them all. Unless you really have a landscape objective, like say in a national park or remote part of a national park, to diversify the landscape with natural fire starts. Other than that, you treat them all like they could turn into the mega fire, and you try and detect them early and put them out.
Interesting. Let's see here. So we've got Jessie on Whidbey Island, and I'm not sure if this is something you'll be able to speak to or not. She says, I don't know if this is in the agenda, but I'd like to learn more about the droughts about 500 years ago. Here on Whidbey assessing tree rings, I have yet to find a tree older than 470 years. Does that have anything to do with fire, you think?
It could. So in a lot of Western Washington, there were episodes of fire. And 1700 was the last really big one. And before that, there's a pretty good record that there was a major episode of fires around 1500. And also another episode of fires going back to the year 1300. And that's kind of where we get that 200-year fire cycle that I was showing you earlier. So it's possible that Whidbey would, basically experienced near complete stand replacement in that large 1500 or so fire episode. I guess that would be my best way to explain that.
Okay, another one from, oh, no, wrong question there. From Matt at the King Conservation District. Data shows that if you can keep a large crown fire 30 feet away from a home, oh, that was sort of an incomplete sentence there. Sorry. What would you say to someone that is concerned about the potential ecological damage when managing to keep a fire 30 feet away? So I guess they're saying if you can keep a fire 30 feet away from home, you're more likely that home's more likely to survive. But what about the damage coming from that? Is it worth it?
Oh. I guess it's up to the individual landowner. I mean,
yeah.
you could have a lawn.
Right.
Yeah, that's so subject to landowner objective. It's hard to answer.
Yep.
Can I add something to that, Patrick?
Sure.
I would argue that if we're talking about ecological damage, the fact that there's a home there is pretty significant ecological damage, and however you manage that vegetation is probably less damage than the home itself.
Solid point.
Yes, thank you for that. I couldn't have said it better.
Yeah. So this one's kind of tough to answer. If we live in a heavily wooded area and the wind-driven fire is approaching, should we stay and fight it, or should we leave early? I guess it's play it safe and leave. But what are your thoughts on that? It's kind of maybe outside the purview of the talk, but.
Yeah, and maybe this is more for Ashley to cover. I'm not sure if she's going to address stay and fight kind of approaches, but I live in a house in the woods on the west side, and if there was a wind-driven event headed my way, I mean, you got to get out of there. There's no staying and fighting that.
Okay.
Yeah, if it seems to be creeping and the weather forecast is great, I don't know. I don't even want to go there, actually. I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have asked that to you, actually. But it is certainly something that people are thinking about, and that's good. I would always say play it safe. But
right.
So one from Elmer, we'll probably do, maybe this might need to be the last one. In the 1900 burns, those seem to be, it sounds like what he's saying is those seem to be related to the logging that was done at that time. How does that play in now? Is it, is that a factor today? And was it a factor then?
Yeah, let's see, the start of the 1902 burn appears to have been manyfold. I think there was actually a lightning event, but there might have been some logging started fires as well. The Tillamook burn was definitely started by logging operations. We know that. So yeah, it was a factor. In today's landscape, you can't say it's not a factor. I mean, we have a lot of fire precaution, levels and so on where we try and mitigate that. But to say there's no risk from it, I'm sure is not true. And humid ignitions seem to be the main driver. So that's the other thing we've been emphasizing is trying to encourage an education campaign to discourage more human ignitions on the west side, since that's accounting for 95% of fire ignitions. You figure without those, if it was just lightning driven, the times that all three of the drivers would all turn up snake eyes would be really rare.
Awesome. Well, I think we need to keep going. There was more questions, and I hope I'm not out of line if I say that it'll be okay for folks to reach out to you, Daniel, if they have other questions.
Sure, yeah.
So we'll maybe provide that information in a follow-up email. But why don't we go ahead and take just a quick, like 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll start right up with Ashley's presentation.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Dan, for the great presentation. Just also want to say thanks to Matt and Sean for providing support and help for today's presentation, as well as their expertise. So yeah, today I'm really just going to be talking about, now that we've learned a little bit more about the Western Washington fire regimes, how do we prepare for them? And there's a lot of distinctions that we need to make and be thinking about, especially on the west side, because of our different fire regimes. So first off, I just want to give you guys a little more introduction in terms of what I do and kind of how I approach my work. My title is Community Wildfire Preparedness Coordinator, and I look at the physical dynamics of a community, so how the community is oriented, where it is geographically, topographically, what ecosystems it's part of, but then also the social dynamics of that community. So how do people interact with their neighbors? Do they have relationships with their neighbors? Are they part of an HOA? What are the socioeconomic, demographic? What are the different components in that community that really make it what it is? And then going from those different components, really looking at how that community can become more fire resilient. Often there's a variety of different resource needs. It might be they need a new plan. They might need additional assessments of their home. They might not even know what that is. It might be that they have certain barriers to action. It might be time, it might be money. There might also just be a lot of additional considerations that they haven't considered yet, especially in Western Washington. A lot of people are pretty new to the concept of wildfire resiliency and what that even looks like in their community. So one of the things that I really focus on, my jurisdiction is the whole state, but there are a lot of partners on the east side, just because this has been part of community neighborhood dialogues for much longer than it has been on the west side. So really looking at how we can approach this in Western Washington at the long-term, short-term, and as well as before, during, and after a fire, because that really is encompassing the different aspects of fire resiliency. I like to share this graphic. This is from the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. Washington was actually the first state that was part of the learning network. And the first state, that had its own learning network with different partners. And we have partners and members from both sides of the Cascades now, and Western Washington is really becoming a larger presence of that. But I like to bring this up just to show that fire resiliency in any community is really going to have a bunch of different components to it. A lot of people focus, and I don't know if you guys can see my mouse moving, focus on just the resident and community mitigation pie slice, which is things like defensible space and home hardening. But there's a lot of other things to consider, things like fuel breaks, but then also social and mental health. How are people going to respond after an event? What are some of the services that are available? What does the local wildfire response look like? What are some plans, like I was saying, or those assessments, community wildfire protection plans? What are those things that are in place already, as well as safety and evacuation? So that's just something to keep in mind. That isn't necessarily going to be the focus of my presentation. I think because Western Washington is still in its first kind of blushes of figuring out what this really looks like, I'm going to be focusing on the lower two, or two of the lower pie slices, so that resident and community mitigation, but also safety and evacuation. I just bring this up to say that there are a lot of components to be considering, and fire adaptation in any community is really, should be thought of as something that's a practice and not necessarily a project. So I'm going to bring up this great graphic again from the Seize It All paper that Dan also shared, just to really show that, yeah, there are a bunch of different types of characteristic fire. And I know that Jesse brought up or wanted us to bring up the fact that Indigenous people, the First Nations of what is now Washington, have been doing controlled burns and using fire as a tool since time immemorial. It's been used to create areas that are used for agricultural purposes, for medicinal purposes, land clearings for hunting, to get rid of diseases and insect infestations. It's been used in wartime. There's a bunch of different reasons why these landscapes have had fire on them, but it's also just key to really note that humans have been an important aspect of how these ecosystems have evolved. Fire has been a key component, and humans were part of that, and continue to be part of it in terms of what that ignition source really is. Let me see, my next slide is not coming immediately. So I wanted to touch just on two things that Dan brought up in terms of the infrequent high severity, that action really being the prepare, and the lavender and beige areas with moderately frequent mixed severity and frequent mixed severity areas being more the action and mitigate. And I just wanted to point one thing out because I think his advice is great, but we have one big thing that's a little bit different from what we have in terms of some of these mixed severity regimes that we historically had. So in a lot of these areas, what we also see that's replacing these ecosystems is the wildland urban interface. And so it doesn't necessarily correlate completely, but a lot of the areas where we had this mixed severity in the past is now areas that have a big different fuel in it. Matt mentioned that homes are a really big disturbance in these environments. These housing developments that we've created are creating a different type of fuel, a different density of fuel than what was here historically, in a way that's unprecedented. It's completely different from what was here before. And so that's another component to this beast that we really need to consider and be thinking about in terms of how we're approaching what we're doing to prepare for wildfire. So yeah, the homes and structures are really that new fuel type and density to be considering. And just to really nail this point home, Dan mentioned this, that often, and I think he mentioned it in the context of the Paradise Fire, that homes are often more combustible. They're the fuel that's going to be more appetizing to a fire. So if we think about it, even in times when it is really dry out, a lot of the vegetation surrounding your house will still have access in its roots to some of that moisture. A house does not have that access, and so often it can be the driest fuels. And so I'm going to share just a few pictures of this. Happens quite often where there's houses that still have green vegetation around them while the house is completely burned down. So we see some trees that have been torched, but there are some that are still standing. This vegetation in the front, I believe, was brought in after the burn, so don't pay attention to that particular bit of vegetation. But another scenario, another example of where a house completely burned down and you still see some green vegetation surrounding it. And this is one of my favorite pictures because it just shows how much more dry the house was compared to the surrounding vegetation. And this is really to just share that we've changed the vegetation in a lot of areas that had that mixed severity, and really bring home the point that if we want to save our homes, we have to start with our homes, especially in Western Washington. We need to start with our homes and work our way out. We cannot be doing these fuel projects and expect that that's necessarily going to save our home. Because like Dan pointed out, sometimes those embers will just go right over the fuel breaks. They can be helpful, but it's really important to start with the home. That needs to be the focus of the first efforts. So I just wanted to go into a few facts that are often surprising to people too, in terms of how we think about fire and what we're thinking about, what we hear in the news, and kind of the stories that we've heard about our state. And so East Side, we've always kind of thought of it as being the fire side of the state. And just a few facts I really want to pinpoint or highlight on this particular slide is currently we do see more intense fires in Eastern Washington. But looking at some of the recent stats, in an area in northeastern Washington that's including Spokane, so a larger metro area that's similar in size to Snohomish, Pierce, and King County, had about 600 fires per year. And this was factors of lightning and human. In western or in eastern Washington, they do have a higher percentage of fires that are starting by lightning. And if you compare that to Western Washington, we're seeing that, as Dan pointed out, most of these fires are human caused, as they have been historically as well. And so that is a trend that continues. But if you look at a similar sized area in Western Washington, so King, Pierce, and Snohomish averaged together, they're seeing about 2,500 starts per year. These fires are not getting as big, but that's more than 4 times as many starts of those natural vegetation fires as they're seeing on the east side. We have a lot more people in Western Washington, so a lot more of those sources of ignition. Dan also mentioned we're going to have a population that's growing, and 2.5 million more people estimated in the next 30 years. Well, I guess now would be that figure was 10 from 2010. So at least probably another million that's going to be coming to Western Washington. And then we also have a lot more people that are seeing these starts, and so as well as a lot more fire response that's within those communities where they can be stopped. And so we're not seeing these fires get as big, but as conditions continue to change, we're going to see those fires potentially get larger, and forces can quickly become overwhelmed if there were to be multiple starts occurring in one community. So just because we are coming at this from a relatively new standpoint, I just wanted to share the fire triangle, what really makes a fire. So there's 3 components to fire. You need oxygen, you need appropriate level of heat, and an appropriate level of fuel. If any of these things is missing, then fire will not occur. And in Western Washington, we can't do much about the oxygen level, but we can do some things about the ignition source, and we can do some things about the fuel, especially those fuels that are on our homes and directly surrounding our homes. So a lot of times people tend to think of, okay, we need to get rid of the big fuels, we need to get rid of the big trees, the big logs that are around our house. And I like to remind people of what they do when they're starting a campfire. You don't necessarily put the biggest logs on the fire, because those aren't going to be the ones that catch the quickest. What's going to catch are the small pieces of kindling. You're maybe going to put a few pine needles, maybe some lichen, something that's going to catch really quick with that match or that flame that you have. And then you start to add the larger pieces. And when you're thinking about that for what are the flammable things around your home, that's the same sort of idea. The smallest things are the things that are going to catch the quickest. And so it's going to be things like pine needles around your house. It's going to be things like deciduous leaves. It's going to be that grass that's dried out over the summer. And so really thinking about where are those small fuels in proximity to your house, as well as maybe on your house. Where are those really collecting? Another thing that I just like to point out is that, and this is something that Al Murphy actually brought to my attention, is that a lot of times in the news we see this video footage of this wall of flames, that this is how the fire is going to come. It's just going to be this wave of flames coming in towards your house, and that's not how fires typically move. That's not how they tend to travel and go towards your house. What we more often see is that there's these embers that will come through the air and will land on your house, so oftentimes these embers will be from leaves, sticks, and bark, those tiny, really easy to ignite fuels, and those will land on your house and maybe ignite some of those other small fuels that are on your house, and will create those bigger bigger ignition sources, bigger flames, bigger sources of fire. So Dan also talked about some of the key ingredients. And one other thing that I just like to add in terms of, instead of it necessarily always being a large event, is that it doesn't necessarily have to always depend on the wind, the east wind events. A lot of times for the fires that can be scary in Western Washington due to the density of our houses is that short-term dry weather. And so I'm going to talk about all of these key ingredients and how to be a little bit more aware of them, and also what you can do to help mitigate some of these fire starts, since it is quite a few fires that we get from people, and they can occur really quickly. So this is something I just wanted to bring up from last year. That was a bit of an eye-opener for a lot of folks, is that we had 45 fires in a 3-day time period in Western Washington. This was in March, so really early in the season. We had some dry weather, a dry season, so seasonal drought, and then we also had some short-term dry weather as well. A lot of times we only need a few days for those fuels to really dry out, and then those ignition sources. So really being aware of what those conditions are, and then what you're doing, what activities you're engaging in that might be a potential ignition source during those times when the key ingredients are otherwise in play. So first off, let's talk a little bit about some ignition sources, some things that we maybe aren't considering or thinking about. So a lot of us think, okay, folks who don't necessarily put out their campfire, those are starting some fires. Folks who flick their lit cigarette butts onto the highway, and those starting those fires along the medians or along the grass strips along our interstates. But there's a lot of things that we do in our day-to-day that cause fires as well. And so thinking about what are those activities that we may be engaging in that we didn't realize were necessarily a fire risk. We see a lot of times people doing pile burns. A lot of fires that happen in later spring or sometimes in earlier spring are caused by pile burns, those embers floating off away from the main pile and igniting something that is several feet, several meters away, and folks having to run over and try and put that out. But that can happen really quickly, and it happens all the time in Western Washington. Your lawnmower, just mowing your very dry lawn, if you were to hit a rock, sometimes that can create a spark on other part of your lawn. Parking your truck in dry grass. This can be any type of dry grass. It can be in a super marine environment like the coast. I know when I worked in Illinois, we had our trucks, they always had these big stickers that said, "Do not park in any tall grass." Really make sure that you're thinking about where you're parking, what's underneath your car, what might be hot, what it might touch that could potentially be a source of ignition, those really fine fuels that it might come in contact with. Exploding targets, those can also be something that causes fires, especially when people are thinking, oh, we've had a lot of rain, or we've had a little bit of rain the past few days. It should be fine if we go out and do these exploding targets in the woods. Oftentimes those things are too dry. And then fireworks. One example I really like to bring up often is a fire that occurred along the Long Beach Peninsula. So this is right along the coast. And the fire occurred on New Year's Day in 2016. I believe 2016, might have been 2017. But people were lighting fireworks because it was the middle of winter. They think, oh, it's the coast, it's a pretty wet environment. What would be ignitable around that time of year in Western Washington, especially along the coast? But on that particular year, they had 3 days of pretty dry weather. A spark from a firework got into some of that longer grass, which then got to the shore pine, which created a fire that was quickly went out of control. Eventually it was extinguished, but I just bring that story up to be aware that these fires can happen at any time of year. It doesn't necessarily have to be fire season for these fires to occur. And so it's really important to just be really thoughtful about what activities you are engaging in, what surrounding potential fuels are around you, because accidents can happen a lot of times. People don't mean to be doing these, don't mean to have these ignitions, but it's really important that we're really cognizant of what those potential ignition sources could be. And again, just to really hammer it home, most of these are started by people, so we really need to be cognizant. I think during Dan's presentation, someone noted that it's almost like people need to be trained in this, and I agree. So that prevention education is really key, especially in Western Washington, because we do have so many starts that aren't meant to occur. There are prescribed burns that do occur, but a lot of times they are occurring at a time when they're not as opportune as they could be. So another thing to just be aware of is thinking about what is the seasonal drought. This is for this year. It was released in May, and these are developed I think on a monthly basis, but this is something that the Climate Prediction Center, the Predictive Services, they put out these. And so this is something that you could have access to if you just go to this URL to look at what is a seasonal drought? What are conditions like? Is it wet enough for me to do activities that I would maybe do at this time of year? So if it's a drier year, maybe you can't do a pile burn in April. Maybe it's too dry to do it. Maybe you need to wait until the fall after there's been some rains and the conditions are a little bit better for that type of activity. So I want to go a little bit into the home ignition zone. I think most people are relatively aware of the concept of the home ignition zone. This is really a way to break down what are the different zones you should be focusing on to harden your home, but then also create that defensible space. And in Western Washington, I really like to focus on just those first two zones pretty exclusively, especially that immediate zone, which is the home, any structures attached, so things like a garage, could be a deck, as well as the 5 feet surrounding all of those structures in the home. I'm going to go a little bit into the intermediate zone, but another thing I think is really, really key in Western Washington is evacuation. We really need to be thinking about how we're planning our evacuation, how we're getting creative about different evacuation routes, because we have a lot of fuel and we have a high likelihood of one of these large events. And so knowing how to evacuate, having alternative routes for evacuation is going to be really key. But let's start with the home, because if you want to save your home, like I said, you need to start with the home and really think about how you can work your way out. And to really try and push this home, I'm going to share a quick video. This is And I don't believe the audio is going to work on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to narrate what's happening basically on this video. Oops, looks like it went all the way across. Let's go back and then add in the closed captioning. So what they're doing in this particular test is they're throwing embers at both sides of this house. The side of the house on the left side has a bunch of materials that are combustible. So you're seeing that wood siding, you're seeing some shrubbery that's right up against the house, as well as some bark mulch that's right up against the house as well. And then on the left side, or on the right side, excuse me, you see a house that has much more of those fire resilient features to it. And so you're seeing things like non-combustible material right at the base. So this is gravel. The siding is fire resilient. So right now, what the firefighters are doing is just putting the fire out and really looking at what occurred when they threw those embers at the house. So, as to be expected, the house had just had embers, and I mean, you guys saw that. It was just those really tiny sparks. It wasn't a wall of flames. This is what occurred to the house. This redwood deck got completely engulfed. It's completely scorched. The bottom of the house is completely scorched. You see a lot of burn marks along that bark, that mulch on the base. This also, the the single pane windows, those cracked in the case of a fire, and that created a huge opening for the house and for embers to go in. On the more fire resilient side of the house, we see that it's relatively unscathed, and these houses were right next to each other. So a lot of times people say, oh, my neighbor hasn't done anything. We look at these houses are what could be a one side of a really fire resilient duplex and one that's not really at all. And we see that even in this non-combustible 5-foot perimeter, there are embers that were just completely extinguished because they did have that spacing right next to the house. And it's so key to really be focusing on that if we're wanting to save our house. So this is, Dan had some pretty scary numbers, but I want to just say that there is some hope. There is some ability to really help our homes be more resilient anywhere we are, and no matter how bad some of the fuels might be. So this is another slide I just like to share, and this is a handout that I could give everyone, but it's just some key points that people tend to overlook in terms of where is a house most vulnerable to embers. And so we see at flame number 3, there in the nooks and crannies along the roof. A lot of times there will be accumulations of sticks and fine needles and maybe some leaves that tend to just pile up over time. And that could be from wind, it could just be from seasonal changes in terms of that vegetation, dropping off the old leaves or pine needles. But knowing where those sources are, where those collection points are along your house is going to be really key. Thinking about where do you need to do that seasonal cleaning. But then also thinking about what are some of the other things that you might not have thought of as being combustible along your house. So things like your fencing leads right up to your house. And a lot of times people have cedar fencing that goes right up to the side of their house. Replacing that with something that is non-combustible for the first 5 feet can be extremely helpful in making your house more fire resilient. Making sure you're thinking about the mats, what is your welcome mat made out of? How close is your garbage to your house? Oops, sorry about that. Even your chimney, thinking about what could come in through your chimney. These are all considerations. I'll go into some of the ways to retrofit these things, but really thinking about where is your home most vulnerable. That's going to be the first really key thing to think about, is where is this accumulation of fine fuels and or what types of fuels tend to accumulate around your house, and how could you potentially mitigate that. So the biggest factor to always be considering, I would say this should be a first priority, is your roof. I still see a lot of cedar shake roofs in Western Washington. Cedar shake roofs are really, really combustible. They are easy to ignite. And so that should be a priority, is to make that less. It's one of the largest surfaces or nearly horizontal surfaces on your house. And so making that more fire resilient is going to pay off extremely high. There are some coatings you can put on cedar shake roofs, but these tend to wear off in a few years, and it's really hard to tell how even your coverage is. And so if it is possible, I always say to change your roofing to something like composite asphalt. You can do steel or clay tiles. There's a lot of options of what makes something a little more fire resilient. And then in addition to that, thinking about other retrofits you can do, like doing gutter covers. So maybe seasonal maintenance is a little bit difficult to do. And so what are some ways that you can make that seasonal maintenance a little less taxing? Putting a gutter cover, make sure that you don't have to go up and clean the leaves out of your gutter on a seasonal basis. That's going to be something that is going to be much easier to do following that retrofit. So another thing so I'm just showing the kind of accumulation, those nooks and crannies. I can't emphasize that enough, how often those occur, and really where to figure out where those are occurring. Sometimes you can take up a tree, cut off some of its limbs, prune back cut some of the trees that are surrounding that maybe are those worst offenders of dropping those needles. That can be another retrofit that you do that takes away from that seasonal maintenance, makes it a little bit easier to do that every year. So thinking about what are those predominant seasonal spots you really have to clean out, and what are ways that you can mitigate that so you don't have those fuels accumulating every year. A lot of people tend to forget about underneath your deck. A deck is a place where people sometimes store junk, which a lot of times is flammable, is combustible, but it can also be a high accumulation of fuel. So thinking about how you're going to clear that out, or if there is an option to potentially keep those fuels out permanently or semi-permanently, putting some type of cover around the bottom of your deck, that's a great option as well. And these are all things that I'm bringing up right now are things that I tend to see a lot in Western Washington. There are quite a few other retrofits that can be done, and things that can be looked at and examined, and I'll go into that at the very end of this presentation. But one thing I see a lot in Western Washington is the mesh size on vents is usually too large. So what we see quite often is 1/4 inch mesh. This mesh will let in the vast majority of embers into your house. And so what we really want to see is this 1/8 inch mesh. You don't necessarily even have to remove the 1/4 inch mesh. You can often just cover the vents with this 1/8 inch mesh over the 1/4 inch. A lot of times I also see these vents that have a bit of a shelf to them. And so that can be a really good shelf for accumulating fuels. And so really key to, if you are adding that 1/8 inch mesh, put it on the outside. Don't put it with that shelf still available for those fuels to accumulate. You don't want anything to be causing more fuels or creating more fuels around your house. And don't forget about these, I think they're called bird vents. I might be getting that wrong. Now I can't think of the phrase for it, but that's okay. A lot of times birds do create little nests in them. So putting that mesh along the outside of these rather than the inside, that will help a lot as well. Okay, and the one thing, one of the last things I want to touch on around the house is just the 5-foot perimeter is so huge. And we saw that in the video, that those fuels right around the house can really be the make or break thing that causes your house to get that radiant heat and then create a larger fire. And so mulch, for some reason, is a big sticking point for a lot of folks. They don't want to take their mulch away from the foundation, away from the foundation of their house. But you can still have really beautiful plantings. I just say replant them 5 feet out. And maybe space them a little bit more. You really want to have that area right around your house to be completely free of anything that is combustible. So things like stone pavers, gravel, even raking it down to dirt is going to be a better option. So yeah, this is a type of planting I see a lot, is just a lot of mulch, a lot of vegetation right next to the house. Just move this out 5 feet. This can still be a really beautiful accent to the side of your house. It just doesn't have to be right at the base of it. So just making it a little more fire resilient. So I'm going to touch briefly on the intermediate zone, which is that 5 to 30 feet beyond your house. But I want to spend a little bit more time on evacuation. And I know we're getting to around 45 minutes, so I wanted to make sure we get to that. So the real key here in the 5 to 30 foot zone is that you want to be spacing the fuels out both vertically and horizontally. And so we tend to think about how we're maybe creating different non-combustible areas horizontally. And so thinking about, okay, well, we have clumps of bushes, we have this trail that runs through this pathway that's non-combustible materials. Maybe we have some rocks, other things that have low combustibility. But we also have to think about how we're limiting the fuel connectivity vertically as well. And so I added this lower picture, which shows that the trees, they do have just a clump of vegetation, but all of the trees in that clump have also been pruned up so that there isn't any connectivity of those lower fuels to some of those grasses that might grow next to this kind of landscaped area that would connect to some of the lower branches and then may lead to a canopy fire. Okay, so just touching again on the infrequent high severity action and prepare. This is going to be important in the Puget Sound lowlands as well, but it's especially important in areas where we did see those fires that were happening with high severity, with those really 100% mortality events where, as Dan said, the areas in black, a lot of times we're seeing a lot of black dead trees after that fire. Okay, so one thing that's really key for preparation in Western Washington is evacuation. And I bring this map up of the predominant types of vegetation in Washington to really share why this is so important. So the green on this map is forest cover. The beige and the yellow are those areas that are grasslands or shrublands. And just to get a better visual, I just want you guys to imagine what it might be like if you had a fire and you were now forced to evacuate. And this is what your backyard looks like. So if you have grasslands, you have a lot of different options of where you could potentially evacuate to. In ShrubSIP, you do too. If you have a truck that has four-wheel drive, you still have a lot of options of how you could potentially evacuate. In Western Washington, we cannot drive through trees. There's very few options of how you could potentially evacuate if your main road out is blocked, if there is fire coming down your main street of your neighborhood. And so thinking about how we're planning for evacuation, planning secondary routes, thinking about what are the different options we really have is going to be key for making sure that we're prepared for these events. So I'm going to bring a few options or just provide a few examples of different things that folks have done. This is actually a map that Lummi Island created for their plan. What they did was they realized that if they were to have everyone evacuate out of the main road, which is where you see this car on the right-hand side of the image, that it would quickly become overwhelmed. That cars would have a higher likelihood of potentially blocking the road. So one thing in Paradise that occurred was people forgot to put their recirc on in their car. So they turned on their AC and they get smoke into their car. They freak out, they leave their car and they start running. That blocks a main road or an only road out of the community. And so splitting it up and having people really prepare what these activities are is something that Lummi Island is taking pretty seriously. So folks in the southern part of this particular community are now planning to evacuate to the old quarry, which will be their safety zone. Folks that are in the northern part of this community are going to be evacuating to a lake, while folks that are in more of the eastern half of this community are going to be evacuating along the main road. But they really had to think about this creatively, think about where are the areas that have a large enough opening that they could provide a safety zone. What are some of the alternative routes that people could use? What are the different options from staying safe for that if there were to be a major fire? This is another option. Crystal Lake is in the process of really developing this, but I thought it was a great map. So this is a community that's wrapped around a lake. There's one primary evacuation route right now, but they are in the process of trying to develop additional evacuation routes. So the secondary evacuation route, part of this is a gravel road that leads up to a water tower, but beyond that, there's only about, I think, 500 feet that it would take to connect that road with another main road or a larger road, established road that could provide another avenue for evacuation. Then they also have a tertiary evacuation route. This is a trail that is currently used by kids who are going to the bus stop over here. And so thinking about, okay, are there certain people in the community that could maybe evacuate this way? Is there ways to make these more accessible, more of an option if the need does occur? The other thing I really want to hammer home, I know we're down to the last few minutes of today, but is creating an evacuation kit. These events are likely going to exacerbate pretty quickly, and so it's going to be hard to have all of your stuff, to gather all of your stuff when the time comes. If you're not ready when the time comes, you likely will be losing a lot of things that you could have saved if you had a little bit of preparation. So one thing I like to say is, I know Dan brought up the large flood events and then earthquake events. Preparing for both of those, even tsunami events, that's the evacuation kit, the emergency kit is going to be really similar. So this isn't necessarily something that you have to create from scratch, or that's going to be something completely new. It's largely going to be the same kit. What you need in an emergency is what you need in an emergency. So thinking about a few days worth of prescriptions, those things like passports and important papers like birth certificates, important family photos, thinking about 3 days worth of clothes and food, and also communication. How are you planning to communicate with your neighbors, with loved ones, if phone lines are down? What are some things that you have in place in that regard? Do you know who to call? Do you know how to get information if there is a different level of evacuation? Do you know what the different levels of evacuation mean? So really becoming educated on those is going to be key for knowing what to do and how to feel more prepared when a need for evacuation does occur. And then finally, I just wanted to say that this is a really brief overview of some of the different things to be thinking about. This is, like I said, fire adaptation is a practice, and there's a lot of different things to consider, both on your home, but then also in your community, in your city, and your county. And so in Western Washington, there are quite a few areas that have already started this process. And so there is ways that if you're feeling overwhelmed, I can come out and actually do an assessment of your house. There's other folks in DNR who can do assessments of your house. Some of the conservation districts can do assessments as well. But folks who maybe have a very similar community may have already started their plan. Maybe they already have a plan. A lot of folks in Western Washington neighbor a public land, so they might be next to public utility district lands or a state park or something that they're seeing as a challenge. There's a lot of different partnerships that have already developed. So communities have already figured out how to create those fuel breaks, how to create alternative evacuation routes, even in Western Washington. And so in my program, I think one of my key roles is really to connect people to the resources that they need to really develop this preparedness, to really figure out what they need and what resources might be missing. Because that's another key component of my program, is to figure out what resources the people of Washington need to be prepared. And Western Washington, like I said, is a relatively new beast. And so as we all become more prepared and we see some of those nuances that come from the differences in Western Washington communities, we'll need to develop those resources. So the more of us that are on this, the better we're all going to be prepared when the time comes. So with that, I'll open it up to questions, and just wanted to thank you all for your time. Really appreciate you spending your Tuesday evening with us, especially because if the weather's anything like it is here, I know it's a relatively nice night. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. That was great. Those examples of the evacuation routes, those were really neat to see. I'm glad that you were able to show us those. So one of the questions we had was kind of more of a logistical thing, and I think we got it covered. But Tom asked if there was a pamphlet available for that fire adapted communities circle chart, probably for people that were interested in getting their neighborhoods involved in that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I could send over a few different things. So I could send over that circle graphic. I could share that. That's just a JPEG that I utilize quite often. But another thing that might be good is just the one pager that the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network shares. I believe it's updated now with some of the newer members. Most of the newer members are in Western Washington. That was something that the executive director really tried to make a priority this past year, was thinking about what are the communities that are ready to be part of the learning network. One thing to just distinguish is that there is the Fire Adapted Learning Network, but there are communities that are considered fire adapted communities. That's not necessarily a program like Firewise USA, but it is kind of a mindset of how to approach fire. So that would be a good thing to just share. It would be that 2-pager or that 1-pager back and front that shares who's really part of that learning network. Because in my experience, everyone who is part of that learning network is more than happy to share some of that expertise of what that looks like in their community, what fire adaptation really looks like. And so, yeah, I'd be happy to share that. And like I said, the people who are kind of the spokespeople for, or the spark plugs for each of those fire adapted communities are usually more than willing to share their expertise and time to help with those efforts of other people trying to get fire adaptation and get started in their community.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. If you send that to me, tonight or tomorrow, I will make sure that goes in the email for folks.
Yeah, sure. I'll make a note right now to send that to you tonight, Patrick.
Okay.
Patrick, I'll follow that up and say also, if you guys are curious about the Fire Adapted Communities Coalition, there is a link that got put into the chat, which will take you to their website where you can find more information on that program.
Great. Yeah, I'll try to make sure I include that link in the email as well. So a question from Joe, which kind of I think we could expand on a little bit. It asks if alders are good for fire suppression. And I think what he's getting at is kind of, are there types of trees and or shrubs, any kind of plant that you would want in that, not necessarily obviously in that 5-foot zone, but outside of that over other kinds of plants?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, so there's a few really good resources for that. So there's something that well, I think originally it was the Washington, Oregon, and Idaho Extension Services, they all put together, was a fire-resistant plants guide for landscaping in our region. And so that has a lot of good options in terms of what things to plant, and it even goes into moisture, water needs, as well as hardiness zones and things like that. And so that's a great resource. I'll also make a note because there is a free PDF that is available of that gives some really specific examples. But things that have like excessive needles, things that have shaggy bark, things that tend to dry out, things that have those volatile oils, those are all things you don't want to have. So there's some key considerations in terms of plant characteristics you want to avoid. And that can go a long way too. You really want to make sure that you're not putting a ton of juniper or what's the other one? I'm forgetting the name. What are those trees? Someone help me out here. I know someone else knows the answer to this tree.
What do they look like?
It starts with an A. Now I'm forgetting the name. It looks like juniper though.
Arborvitae or
Arborvitae.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Thank you. Perfect. Yeah, arborvitae. Those are awful. So make sure that those are not necessarily close to your house. I would say if you have them, it might be better to take them out. A lot of people call those green gas cans because they light up really quickly.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, got another one. Are rooftop sprinklers effective for saving a home surrounded by trees? How about large water tanks?
It can be, but it's good to keep in mind how much you actually have in your community in terms of water flow. If you turn it on, sometimes electricity can go out. So if it's electricity dependent, that can be an issue. But then also thinking about how much water you might have in your community. Are you taking a lot of water from your neighbor's yard if you're putting it on? Some people are on wells, but is that going to be the best use for your house? I don't know. I've heard of sprinkler malfunctions, and so I'm on the fence about that one in terms of if I think it can be effective, but sometimes it can malfunction, so it shouldn't be your first line of defense. If it's kind of like a temporary fix where you're thinking, okay, I'll do this for a while before I can really replace my roof. If it's a cedar shake roof, sure, do that. But often, if you have composite shingles and you're really, even composite shingles, but then especially if you have things that are non-combustible, those are really good options for being fire resilient. I don't know if you guys have seen the Jack Cohen video where he puts like an inch of pine needles on top of a composite roof, lights it on fire, but that roof is completely fine after. And so it's really making sure that you're maintaining your roof, keeping it clear. You don't want to necessarily have that many needles, but in a lot of cases, that is a really good protective barrier if it is well maintained. So yeah,
Okay.
just my thoughts.
So Matt from King County had a comment that I feel like is something worth mentioning. With evacuation plans, please ensure you're taking into consideration your pets or livestock, which I know can certainly be a thing in Western Washington.
Definitely, yeah. And some people that can really speak to that are the folks down in Stevenson County when Eagle Creek fire was occurring and it was jumping the Columbia. A lot of people in those communities were trying to figure out how to evacuate their animals, and so they came up with some procedures kind of on the fly of how to do that. But thinking about where you might take your animals in the event of an emergency, how you would transport them, are there alternative options for how to transport them? There are more resources to this on the east side, I will say, but those can definitely be borrowed and a lot of times utilized in Western Washington as well. And I don't know of a particular resource that's just like a brochure on that, but I can take a look and just ask around, because I'm sure there is something that exists to that in terms of how to really create a good plan for your livestock. Yeah.
So how do you figure out if you're in a high risk or a high need area?
Oh, in terms of fire risk?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that, I feel like Dan might be able to help with that too, but in terms of maps, we are developing different maps that show different higher risk areas versus those that are lower risk. Western Washington hasn't got nearly as much data over the years as Eastern Washington in terms of really kind of teasing out those different risk factors, just because some of the risk factors are really different in Western Washington. Some of the things that could be potentially helpful is the fire action plan, or the forest action plan, excuse me, is coming out. I believe it was due today, if it hasn't come out already, but it was due by June 30th. And so that should be available soon. And that shares what some of the real priority areas are that have been outlined, at least by DNR, in terms of what we think really need to be treated. And so that's one resource. The WUI map is also getting its final touches. So that's being finalized today by my colleague, and should be available in early July for everyone. That isn't necessarily tied to risk, but wildland urban interface, just being those areas where the fuels are really changing, where the density of fuels is changing, where it's also really close to wildlands, that can also be a factor to include and really think about when you're thinking about fire risk. But yeah, I think another thing that often is just to consider is what are the different types of fuels around your house? What are your evacuation options? Do you live in a community that only has one way in and one way out? That could be a high source of risk too. So sometimes it's not just going to be the topography or or the vegetation, or
Right.
or those other factors that we tend to think of as just being what creates fire risk.
Sure. Yeah. Matt, Dan, Sean, either you have any thoughts on that too? Doesn't sound like it. That's all right. I think in the interest of staying somewhat on time, I will make that the last question and remind you that I'll send a follow-up email with Dan and Ashley's information, as well as Matt and Sean's. If you want to ask any questions, I'm sure they're more than willing to get an email from you. But a big thank you to Dan and Ashley in particular for giving these talks. I think this was a really good an opportunity to inform and hopefully empower a little bit. Obviously, Dan's talk, as you mentioned, can be a little bit scary, but Ashley, hopefully gave you some actionable strategies to protect your home, and start thinking about that stuff, because it's better to think about it now than when it's too late, for sure. So if you guys don't have anything else to add, I'll go ahead and just say thank you for joining us tonight, and I'll catch you with that email with all those extra resources soon.
Thanks for putting this on, Patrick. We appreciate it.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Sean.
thank you very much, Patrick. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.